October 27, 1962. Deep in the waters of the Sargasso Sea, a Soviet B-59 submarine is being hunted. The air conditioning has failed. The temperature inside is over 113 degrees Fahrenheit. The crew is fainting from carbon dioxide poisoning. Above them, the U.S. Navy is dropping signaling depth charges, explosives meant to force them to the surface. But the Soviet captain, Valentin Savitsky, doesn't know they are signaling charges. He thinks the war has already started. He thinks Russia might already be burning. He orders his men to arm the special weapon. It is a 10-kiloton nuclear torpedo. He prepares to fire it at the USS Randolph, the American aircraft carrier hunting them. If he fires, the US retaliates with full nuclear force. The world ends in roughly 20 minutes. Protocol requires 3 officers on board to agree to launch. The captain says yes. The political officer says yes. But the third man, the flotilla chief of staff, Vasili Arkhipov, says no. We are often told that the Cuban Missile Crisis was a chess match between John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev. But history shows us something far more terrifying. It wasn't a chess match. It was a chaotic scramble in the dark, where a single word from a man you've never heard of was the only thing standing between us and extinction. This is the true story of the 13 days when time almost ran out. To understand why the world almost ended in October 1962, you have to look at the map. The United States had the Soviet Union surrounded. In Turkey, just minutes of flight time from Moscow, the Americans had stationed Jupiter nuclear missiles. The Kremlin felt like they had a gun pressed against their temple. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev decided to even the odds. He looked at Cuba, a communist outpost just 90 miles from Florida, and saw an opportunity. He launched Operation Anadir. It was one of the greatest logistical deceptions in military history. The Soviets shipped over 40,000 troops and dozens of nuclear missiles to Cuba, claiming they were merely agricultural supplies and machine parts. For months, American intelligence missed it. Until the morning of October 14th, an American U-2 spy plane, piloted by Major Richard Heiser, drifted over San Cristobal, Cuba. He snapped 928 photographs in 6 minutes. When CIA analysts examined the film, they didn't see palm trees. They saw geometry, a trapezoidal pattern, canvas-covered trailers. These were SS-4 medium-range ballistic missiles. These missiles could carry a 1-megaton warhead, 50 times the power of the Hiroshima bomb. They could hit Washington, D.C. in roughly 12 minutes. There would be no time to evacuate. There would be no time to say goodbye. President Kennedy was informed while eating breakfast. He immediately convened the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM. The room was divided. On one side were the Hawks, led by the generals, including Air Force Chief of Staff Curtis LeMay. LeMay was a man who dealt in absolutes. His advice was brutal and immediate. Bomb the missile sites. Invade Cuba. Wipe them out before the missiles become operational. LeMay told the president that anything less than an invasion was appeasement. But there was a problem. The CIA wasn't sure if the nuclear warheads were already in Cuba or if the local Soviet commanders had the authority to use them. If the US bombed Cuba and a single Soviet commander survived to fire a single missile, millions of Americans would die. Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General and the president's brother, pushed back. He argued that a surprise airstrike on a small nation would be a Pearl Harbor in reverse. It would destroy America's moral standing in the world. For days, they argued in secret. The American public knew nothing. Life went on. People went to work. Children went to school, unaware that in a windowless room in Washington, men were calculating the acceptable number of casualties in a global war. JFK eventually chose a middle path, not an airstrike, but a quarantine, a naval blockade to stop any more Soviet ships from entering Cuba. He called it a quarantine because a blockade is technically an act of war. On October 22nd, Kennedy went on television. He told the world, "It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States." The secret was out. Panic set in. In supermarkets across America, shelves were stripped bare. People hoarded canned goods and water. In schools, children practiced duck and cover drills that everyone knows wouldn't have saved them. The world held its breath. On Wednesday, October 24th, the quarantine line went into effect. Soviet ships were steaming toward the line of American warships. If they crossed, the U.S. Navy would fire. If they fired, the Soviets would return fire. In the White House, they waited for reports. Secretary of State Dean Rusk whispered to National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, "We're eyeball to eyeball," and I think the other fellow just blinked. Some Soviet ships turned back. But the crisis wasn't over. The missiles were still in Cuba, and the construction crews were working day and night to make them ready to fire. Meanwhile, Fidel Castro, the Cuban leader, was convinced the Americans would invade. He sent a frantic cable to Khrushchev, essentially urging him to launch a nuclear first strike if the US invaded. Khrushchev was horrified. He realized he had lost control of his ally. He wrote back, telling Castro, "You have proposed that we be the first to carry out a nuclear strike. This would be the end of our civilization." The tension peaked on October 27th. Black Saturday. An American U-2 flown by Major Rudolph Anderson was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. Anderson was killed instantly, the only combat casualty of the crisis. The generals in the White House were furious. They had agreed earlier, if a U.S. plane is shot down, they will bomb the sites immediately. They demanded the president give the order. The B-52 bombers were circling, fully loaded with nuclear weapons, waiting for the code. Kennedy hesitated. He pulled back from the brink. He assumed, correctly as it turns out, that the order to shoot down the plane didn't come from Khrushchev, but from a panicked local Soviet commander. Kennedy decided not to retaliate, yet, but time was up. The U.S. military set the invasion of Cuba for Monday. It was Saturday night. In the middle of the chaos, a strange thing happened. The White House received a letter from Khrushchev. It was long, rambling, and emotional. He wrote about the horror of war, saying the two nations are tugging on a knot that will eventually strangle them both. He offered a deal. The Soviets would remove the missiles if the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba. Kennedy was ready to accept. But then, hours later, a second letter arrived. This one was broadcast publicly on Radio Moscow. It was hardline. It demanded a higher price. The U.S. must remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The White House was stunned. They couldn't publicly remove the Turkey missiles. It would look like a surrender, shattering the NATO alliance. This is where the genius of the strategy came in. Kennedy decided to ignore the second letter and answer the first one. While the president drafted a public response accepting the no invasion terms, he sent his brother, Bobby Kennedy, on a secret mission. Bobby met with the Soviet ambassador, Anatoly Dobrynin. The conversation was tense. Bobby told Dobrynin that the U.S. military was ready to invade Cuba in 48 hours. He offered a secret quid pro quo. He said, "We will pledge not to invade Cuba, and regarding the missiles in Turkey, we cannot remove them publicly. But if you take your missiles out of Cuba, the Jupiter missiles in Turkey will be gone within 6 months. But you can never speak of this deal. If you claim this was a trade, we will deny it." It was a bluff and a promise wrapped in a threat. Dobrynin relayed the message to Moscow. On Sunday, October 28th, Khrushchev accepted. He announced on Radio Moscow that the Soviet arms would be dismantled and returned to the USSR. The world exhaled. The 13 days were over. In the aftermath, Kennedy was hailed as a hero who stood firm and forced the Soviets to blink. Khrushchev was seen as weak, a leader who backed down. 2 years later, he was ousted from power, largely because of this humiliation. The American public never knew about the secret deal. The Jupiter missiles in Turkey were quietly removed months later, labeled as obsolete. It took decades for the full truth to come out. That compromise, not just strength, saved the world. But let's go back to that submarine. The B-59. Years after the crisis, at a conference in Havana in 2002, former adversaries met to discuss what really happened. An American revealed that they had no idea the submarines were nuclear-armed. They thought they were dropping harmless warning charges. A Soviet officer then stood up and revealed just how close Captain Savitsky came to firing that torpedo. He revealed that Vasili Arkhipov, the man who said no, had only been on that specific submarine by pure chance. As the flotilla chief of staff, he could have been on any of the boats. If he had been on a different sub, or if he had stayed in port, the order to fire would likely have been unanimous. We like to think that history is made by great men making great speeches, but the Cuban Missile Crisis teaches us a different, more humbling lesson. We survived October 1962 through skilled diplomacy, yes. But we also survived because a local commander in Cuba didn't have the codes to fire. We survived because JFK ignored a general who wanted war. And we survived because one man in a hot, sinking submarine refused to press a button. We didn't just manage the crisis, we got lucky. Vasili Arkhipov died in 1998. The world was largely unaware that he had saved it. The question isn't whether we can handle a crisis like that again. The question is, will our luck hold out next time? If you're new to this channel, we kindly request you to subscribe. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like. It really helps and motivates us to bring you more amazing content.